Welcome to another edition of the Know Your Faith program and another spiritually enriching hour. The Know Your Faith program is a collaboration of CREDI, the Catholic Religious Education Development Institute, OPPD, Office of Parish Pastoral Development, and CAMSEL, Catholic Media Services. I am Maria Byron, Director at CREDI, and your moderator. So viewers, a very special welcome. Thanks for joining us again for this session. You know, we've been journeying together for a while. I have learned a lot, as I am sure you have. We have been challenged, put into reflective moods, and we have certainly sharpened our responses to be able to explain our faith. All in all, we have got to know our faith better. But if you have missed any of the presentations, remember that you can view any or all of them on Catholic TT, Trinity TV, and YouTube anytime. You are definitely invited to journey with us on this faith formation excursion. This is the second and final session on the topic hospitality. We have focused on the theme Christian hospitality, a moral obligation. And in our previous session, the presenter transported us to the Old Testament and the roots of Christian hospitality. In this session, our presenter will conclude with a presentation, if you remember that bold title, where we will be jolted into understanding Christian hospitality as requiring us to move from hogs to hugs. And our presenter is again Dr. Adana James. Remember the Belmont girl? With a PhD in theological ethics from Leuven University in Belgium, and currently lecturer in theology at the Seminary of St. John Vianney and the Uganda Martyrs. Adana, Dr. James, welcome again.
Thank you.
And
Thank
to
you
start
so
us off, please lead us in prayer.
So I thought that I would start today's prayer with a psalm, Psalm 23, that famous Psalm of David, the Lord's shepherd, because it really speaks to me personally, and I'm hoping that it can speak to you as well, about the quality of hospitality that our God offers us. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Amen.
Amen. Dana, that psalm always moves you, no matter the mood. So after the session our last session, I had people call and say, that was a good teacher. They learned so much. So I expect like a good teacher, you're going to review what we did last week before you get into the new topic. You know, the good set induction, the segue. So,
Well, I will have to see if I really am a good teacher by questioning my student. So, Maria, are you ready for the? Yes, you. I want to
oh,
see.
so you get back at me. All right. Okay.
Right. I want to see if I really was a good teacher last week.
Well, ask me a 101 question, right?
So let me hear. Did you remember anything from last week's session on hospitality when we looked at the Old Testament?
Do you see the color of my hair?
Wisdom.
Let's see seriously. There was so much though, Adana, that you brought to us, because when you took that Old Testament and you took Abraham and you sent us, you know, and then Moses and the journey through, I think I remember in some of that, you know, the land that they were in, a strange land, strangers, aliens, you know. But there was one word that you used that I think I remember: risk. That if we're going to be hospitable, we have to take risks. So how am I doing?
You're doing good, you know. You get 8. I'll give you 8.
8? 8
Yes.
out of not 100, I hope.
No. You're almost there. You almost got a total mark there.
Well, fill in the gaps now. What do you think I should have said to get the other 2?
Great. So I like how you were able to remember the father of our faith, Abraham, and that story as being able to link us back to God's hospitality and what God wanted us to remember. So when we think about hospitality in the Old Testament, one of the things that we have to remember is the Greek word and the origins, because hospitality had to do with the love for the stranger. I don't know if you remember that, Maria.
Oh, yes.
The love for the stranger. And this was a very different concept to what we have come to know hospitality as today. And we also learned that it was a sign of deep morality. So how hospitable you were corresponded to how moral you were. And so communities and persons were judged by their hospitality, especially their hospitality, of course, to strangers. If you were hospitable, you were deemed moral. Inhospitality was therefore a sign of immorality. We also learned that our early fathers of the faith considered that welcoming the stranger meant welcoming the divine. So we saw that in the stories of Abraham and his relative Lot, where they welcomed strangers and unknowingly welcomed a divine presence among them. And then we saw the same a little later on in history with the prophet Elijah when he visited the widow of Zarephath, and she welcomed him. At the end of that meeting, she was able to say, wow, this truly is a prophet. It was connected to Israel's identity, you see, and that identity forms part of a story. The story of how the people of Israel were aliens in a land not theirs, and therefore vulnerable. They were oppressed, and God rescued them from that land and brought them to a land of their own. And because of that important memory, they were to keep that and use that as the basis for the way that they would treat others in their land that was now theirs. And so they were now to welcome any strangers in their midst. And so important was this concept, it had to be written into law. And what are some of the things that they really needed to remember? They needed to keep their eyes on the fact that God was their sole benefactor. That this land that they had really belonged to God, and they were just stewards of this land. They were to always keep in mind that story of God's hospitality to them. how was God's hospitality experienced? Through their deliverance, coming out of oppression, coming out of being strangers and being vulnerable to living in a space of peace in their own space. And they were to treat others how they were treated by God. And so basically, this more or less summed up the experience of hospitality. And oh, there's an important one I almost forgot, that there was serious consequences because this was a serious concept.
Yes.
Hospitality brought divine blessings, and inhospitality brought divine judgment, as we saw in the case of Lot and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So basically, this is what we looked at last week. And as we deal with hospitality in the New Testament and in the early church, and a little bit about our church today, we're going to try to see what links there are between the Old Testament and the New Testament and what we should still keep in mind for today. So a crucial concept that all of this kind of hangs on is the concept of stranger. And while in the Old Testament, stranger had a very specific notion, because this was a nomadic culture, people who were moving from lands and therefore found themselves in different territories. Stranger, if we have to think about that concept for us today, means a whole variety of things. And we just have to ask ourselves, how are we strangers today? Do we know who our neighbors are? Do our neighbors know who we are? Are we on speaking terms with our family members? Do you feel strange among your own family? Are you bullied at school? Do you feel like a stranger there? What about you and your spouse? Are you living as strangers? Are our Venezuelan neighbors strangers to us? What about our grandmother or aging mother with dementia or aging father with Alzheimer's? Has he become strange to you? Are you a stranger to him? What about your gay son or daughter? Are they strangers to you? What about people who have different political beliefs? People of different socioeconomic backgrounds? What about different races? What about different religions? And COVID, has that made us now strangers to each other? So as you would see, it's a deep concept. It's not just about the person who comes from another place. There are many ways that we feel alienated and estranged from each other. And I want you to think about that as I kind of lead us into thinking about the concept in the New Testament. And what you're going to start to encounter in the New Testament is someone who is quite strange indeed. Jesus, the supreme stranger, fully divine, fully human. This being would end up being strange to everybody he would come in contact with. And if we look at the story of how this being came among us, it is a story of strangeness, starting with the Annunciation, with the visit of Angel Gabriel to Mary, where he asked of her, would you be willing to welcome this stranger into your body, into your life? And of course, it was a puzzling thing. How can this be since I am a virgin? And then with Jesus' birth, when it was time for Jesus to be born, he went back to the town of his origins because that's how they ended up in Bethlehem. A census was taken. Everybody had to return to their town, to their origins. And in this place of origins, there was no place for Jesus or for Joseph or for Mary. And of course, we know the end of that story, which is that they ended up bringing Jesus to bear in a manger. And so he came into a place where he had to end up being born on the outskirts, on the outside. So from his beginnings, he is on the outside. And throughout his whole life, people would always be questioning, who is this man? This man would walk on water, but we know him. We know his mother. We know his father. Where did he get all this knowledge? The man who was able to multiply loaves. The man who was able to calm the storms. What sort of man is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? And then the stranger who eventually died. A strange death indeed. Not the death so much, but what happened after that? There was nobody to be found after Jesus died. And so we see Jesus as the supreme stranger. And so we're going to look at the New Testament because it's difficult to go through the entire New Testament. There's so many stories that we can pick up and highlight. We are going to focus more or less on Luke, on the book of Luke. And there's a particular interpretation that I like. And because of it, I'm going to present it. Where Luke is looking at Jesus and his coming as the visit of the stranger, the visitation of the stranger. And the whole of the Gospel of Luke would be about how we either welcome the stranger as good news or we reject the stranger violently. And so what we would see is a combination of stories of Jesus in his time here and how people are responding to him. And lessons are being learned through that and really kind of portraying for us how hospitality and inhospitality is unfolding. So if we go to the institution of Jesus' ministry, so we're going to pass through his early life a little bit for the sake of time, and we're going to go straight to the institution of his ministry. That famous Luke 4 text when Jesus walks into the temple. Now, he did something that was quite customary. The scroll was handed to him, nothing strange there, and he read a text from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim release to captives, to give new sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the Lord's year of favor. And what we are seeing here is when Jesus is speaking, because later on he would say, today this text is being fulfilled. What we would see here is that the concept of stranger is taking on not so much of a new twist because it was always there in the prophets of the Old Testament, but Jesus would really want us to kind of direct our attention to the many different types of alienation that was taking place at that time and letting us know that in him coming and in him being here, the visit of God was upon us. And how were the strangers to be welcomed? They were to be welcomed in specific ways according to their need. So whereas in the Old Testament, the strangers were welcomed, washed their feet, we invited them in because they would have been coming from very long journeys. They ate with families, they were refreshed. Here we see refreshment continuing to take place, but it's specific to their needs. So where there's the blind, they are being given new sight. Where we find those who are captive, they are being set free. Where there are those who can't hear, they will be now be given the ability to hear. And this is the kind of hospitality that Jesus is going to be asking of us, to look for those on the margins and to attend to their needs. So let's see how they responded to this proclamation. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. But wait, that's not the end of that text. Because then Jesus would go on to say, yes, but you will ask me why I cannot do the miracles here that I have been doing in other towns. And then he said, you know why? Because a prophet is never accepted in the prophet's hometown. So with this, he is now no longer just Jesus, son of Mary and Joseph. He is now identifying himself as a prophet, and that's not being welcomed. The response is that all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town. They led him to the brow of the hill so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he escaped. And so we see immediately the contrast to the stranger. How are people responding? Some are welcoming. Some are willing to throw him off the cliff. Some are welcoming insofar as he says what they want him to say. And from the time he diverts, from the time he's too strange, he's met with violence. And so Christ's journey throughout the New Testament, Jesus' journey throughout the New Testament, is one where he will be almost like a wandering stranger. We remember that famous text when he encountered some people and he was going on to another place and someone said, Lord, I want to go with you. And he said, let me tell you something. Foxes have dens and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to rest his head. So he journeyed from town to town, spreading his message. And while spreading his message, not just being the stranger who people were responding to, he was also being the host. He was also being the one who would welcome other strangers, those who were sick, those who were blind. So from town to town, people would start to bring out their sick, their blind, their paralyzed, their deaf, their demon possessed. They would follow him because there was word of the one who was welcoming them back into the community. These were all persons who had found themselves out of the community. And so one of those travels led him to the town of Jericho. And in that town, we encounter the famous story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. For those of you who don't really remember this story, Zacchaeus was described, I think it's the only time in scriptures that we have someone described as the chief tax collector. So he was a very rich man. This is what we know of Jericho. We also know that there's a lot of trade going on in Jericho at the time. Interestingly, this is a journey that Jesus is making from Galilee to Jerusalem, his last journey to Jerusalem. And so he enters this town of Jericho. He's passing through, and in it, there is Zacchaeus, who only hears that he's passing through because he's too short. The scriptures tell us he is too short to be able to see beyond the crowd. So what does he do? He climbs up on the nearest tree, and as he sees Jesus passing, Jesus looks up to him and says, Zacchaeus, come down. Today, I must stay at your house. And then the text goes on to talk about how Zacchaeus welcomes him. Now, as I said, Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector, which meant that he made his money off of others. So not only did he collect taxes, but he put in a little extra. He taxed the tax, so to speak, and therefore was becoming rich off of others' poverty. So he was not very well liked. And here, what we would see is a particular kind of hospitality that Jesus would be showing. It would be the hospitality of forgiveness, which would be crucial because forgiveness is for sinners, those who find themselves on the margins. And so Zacchaeus represented the sinner. And we'll deal with this story a little more in detail later on, as we go through a deeper meditation on this text because it's a crucial text to help us to understand these new notions of hospitality that are beginning to develop and would become marked as Christian as time goes on. And also in Luke, what we have is how we start to see the development of Christian hospitality in particular. And the great feast, or the great banquet, as it's called in some texts, Luke 14, really describes a situation where Jesus was invited to dinner with some elders of the community. And in it, he noticed how people were behaving. People were trying to get to the front. People were trying to get to the top place. So he noticed what the guests were doing, but he also noticed the motivations of the host behind inviting people there. And he said something after he was observing all of this. He said, let me tell you something. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return. And the particular shape of Christian hospitality that Jesus wants to start portraying here would be seen. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And then Jesus goes on to give the parable of the great banquet. And in the great banquet, he's kind of ushering or telling us a story of what God's kingdom is going to be like. It's going to be a kingdom where all would be welcome. So the parable that follows immediately after this little, not warning, but this little saying by Christ, the parable that follows is the parable of this great feast and this great banquet. And in it, he's saying, you know, the host put on a dinner and invited certain persons, and they had special invitations, and they all delayed in coming. They didn't take it seriously, and the host got angry and said, you know what, well, let's extend it to everyone. And this is an important text for Christianity, because as Christianity would develop, we would see that based on who would respond to Jesus as the banquet and who would reject Jesus as banquet and a stranger, we would see that the people of Israel would be the ones to have rejected him, and therefore the hospitality is now open to others. And this would be how the early church starts to be formed, and what would particularly characterize the early church. It would be a church that would move beyond the people of Israel and spread its arms out to the Greeks, to the Gentiles, to those on the margins. So it would break cultural barriers, and it would go on and on to transcend everything that went before, simply because of its hospitality. So it was a crucial concept. It marked the early church. It set the early church apart a little bit from those that went before in terms of the people of Israel. This was now breaking open hospitality, so to speak, in a way that was quite unexpected. And because hospitality always ushered in the divine blessed the efforts. And so this is how the church ended up growing and spreading and becoming what we know of it today. And so another crucial concept in hospitality we would see in the text of Jesus appearing to his disciples after the crucifixion, they not realizing that it's him, and it's the famous story of Emmaus. So in this story, the disciples are bereft with grief over what has happened. They were hoping that this would have been the Messiah, but he is dead. And on top of that, they cannot find the body. So they are inconsolable. And as they walk, this stranger who they don't know kind of start admonishing them and telling them, listen, why are you so sad and downcast? This is what was proclaimed. This is what they said was to come. And what was it? And he opens the scriptures to them. And as they continued to talk and walk, the evening was drawing on and he was going on. And they said, no, 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 stay with us. So they extended hospitality to the stranger. Stay with us. Let's have a meal together. And in this meal together, a miraculous and fantastic thing occurs that would go on to be fundamental for Christianity after that. When he breaks bread, they realize this is Jesus. This is the divine. And he quickly evaded their grasp after that. But their hearts were already burning and they raced back to Jerusalem with this great and fantastic news. And so we can call this the institution of the Eucharist in Luke's narrative. And a fantastic thing happens in that Christ is saying, as you welcome the stranger and as you break bread, Christ will continue to be present to us. This will continue to be how the divine will go on to be present in our midst. And so this would go on to form an important part of the early church and how we have now come to be known as a Eucharistic people. So not the Eucharist as a thing that we get, but how we all become a Eucharistic people. This is a meal of meals where everyone is supposed to be welcomed, invited. No one is supposed to be shut out. No sinners, no outcasts, no migrants, no refugees. Nobody is to be left outside of this. And as oftentimes as this happens, and as we share in this hospitality, as we share in this meal, the divine comes. And when the divine comes with great blessings. And so we have to ask ourselves an important question. We see what developed in the early church. We see that it caused hospitality to spread. It caused the church to spread when they continued to partake of this hospitality. But we also have to ask ourselves the question, is this that Jesus ushered in, is this what is now present in our church communities? And we have to be willing to kind of answer that question. And what we realize is that perhaps we are not as hospitable as we ought to be. And the element of the Old Testament and the judgment that follows still remains, as we would see in the teachings. So Jesus would say in the final judgment, according to Matthew, he gives this parable to let us know about the consequences of our hospitality and our inhospitality. So he says, you know, this is a parable about the sheep and the goats, and he pulls the sheep to one side and he says, come, you blessed of my Father, come inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And they would be surprised. They would say, when did we see you? And he would say, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. Just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. And they will be enlightened and then they would recognize the divine. On the other hand, he would also say to those on his left that they would not inherit that. And they would ask, why? When did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and didn't take care of you? And I just thought I would let the images speak for themselves. When did that happen? That happened when we dumped our elderly in homes without looking back for them. That happened when we refused to be hospitable to the refugees among us. That happened each time somebody else involved in some gang-related something died and we said, these criminals, these cockroaches. As often as we rejected and as often as we refused to care for those who were least among us, we did it to Christ. Just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And so, as I said, we are going to go into a time of meditation now on the text of Jesus and Zacchaeus. And so this would be a Lectio, just like the one that we did in our last session in the Old Testament. And as we have been progressing, we have been seeing the story of hospitality unfold and what it has come down to and what we are being asked to do. And we only have to look at our communities to know how inhospitable they are. When I was doing this presentation, I called around a number of persons and I asked them, describe for me if you've ever been or experienced inhospitality. And the kinds of stories that were shared, they were unimaginable. But they were stories of great pain. A lot of stories led to persons no longer going to that particular church and opting to go to other churches instead, other parishes where they would feel welcome. And this unwelcome would be across the board, from the priest to the parishioner. Many, many kinds of stories of inhospitality and deep hurt that people have not been able to get over. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, where does all this inhospitality come from? And the reason that I'm bringing up the Jesus and Zacchaeus story again is because I would like to, when I read this story and I realized what it brought up in me, it made me to start to think again about the sources of all this inhospitality. And so we just go to that story now. Luke 19. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull up this story here. So as I recalled for you, this was the story of Jesus going from town to town. And he was going to the town of Jericho. And so as he goes from town to town, he picks up people on the way. And they kind of continue following him. So by the time he gets to Jericho, there's a crowd with him. And as he goes through this crowd, as I said, this story from Luke 19, which I'm just trying to pull up, but it's kind of gone from. So we'll just go through this as a Visio Divina. And as we follow this story along, we will see that this is a story of Jesus going into the community of Jericho. And there is a crowd of people. And what we are told of this story is that this is a story of Zacchaeus, who is described as a tax collector, a chief tax collector. And even though he's described as someone who is very rich, he's also described as someone who is very short. And so he is unable to see Jesus as Jesus is passing by. So what does he do? He rushes to the nearest sycamore tree and he says, I will climb that tree and I will see Jesus for myself as he passed by. And as he climbs the tree, Jesus approaches. Okay, so finally the text has now come up so I can read it. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd could not because he was short. So he ran ahead, climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, look, he is gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. And so just to guide us through the steps of Lectio, remember that it's about reading the text slowly. So if you can find that text, Luke 19, you read it again slowly. What would then follow would be a meditation in terms of your own experience of the text. And lastly, this is something that ought to lead us to pray. As I just show back the images, it will just kind of jog your mind again about this story. About the huge crowd that was gathering. Zacchaeus attempts to see who Jesus is. Jesus saying, Zacchaeus, come down. The others in the crowd who were upset at the fact that Jesus would want to go to Zacchaeus' house and to eat with him. Jesus saying that today salvation has come to this house. This was a difficult text in the sense that each time I read the text, I was brought back and back again to who am I in this story? If I were the crowd, if I was Zacchaeus. And actually, I saw myself in both. And when I saw myself, it wasn't a nice self that I saw. So this is where the story of sin steps in, as these texts are always stories of sin. But they are also always stories of grace. So if we remember, in this story, Zacchaeus was rich, but he was short. And he couldn't see because he was being blocked. So I see myself sometimes as the crowd, blocking other people from getting to see Jesus. And I'll just share with you a simple story. And it just kind of came to mind, and I thought that I would share it with everyone. When I was preparing for this, I had asked a relative of mine to help me out. And she offered, she sat and she was quite in awe and she was following along and everything. And then there came a point where I said something that she didn't agree with. And instead of allowing her to continue, I continued the argument, and the argument just went back and forth, back and forth. And at the end of it, we kind of had to just end everything. And this was supposed to be me preparing for a text on hospitality. What I realized at the end of that is that I was acting as the person blocking the other person from seeing who Jesus was. I wasn't recognizing that other person as having anything to offer. I was probably remembering a lot of things that had happened in the past. And because of that, it was blocking both me and her from getting to see who Jesus was. I just couldn't hear where she was coming from. I couldn't hear this difference that she was bringing. But I also feel like Zacchaeus sometimes. I feel like the person who is being blocked, and not being blocked so much by others, but being blocked by the memory of things that I have done. And so I get back to that same argument. It brought me back to arguments that have happened between us as relatives in the past that I couldn't just allow myself to get beyond. And so I always take the response, which is to go away and to go off by myself, like Zacchaeus up in the tree, away from everybody. And as Christ was passing, Christ was saying to me, come down, be on that flat and on that same level as everybody else, and allow yourself to experience my grace. And so for me, this was a powerful story, because what I realized is that when we have to start speaking about hospitality in communities and in parishes, and we speak about how inhospitable some people are, it's an inhospitality that starts in our hearts, in each and every one of us. Every individual is inhospitable to whatever is different and whatever is strange. And instead of appreciating difference as something that's good and welcome it, we get insecure. At least that was at the heart of the way that I had behaved and was preventing me from listening and blocking both myself and the other person. So this called me to repent, to ask God forgiveness for those many times that I just don't listen to what someone else has to say, that I react in a negative way because of who is in front of me, and to be attentive to those triggers so that I too and that person could experience salvation. So that when I go and I have to take on any position in my parish, I won't continue to act out of that way. So that was my deep down prayer for myself. And so going into this time of prayer for myself, I would like to extend it to you. And I would like for us to focus on some questions. And as we think about these questions, they would call to mind particular experiences for us, maybe, and would probably cause us to want to cry out to God in prayer. What do we have to change in our church community so that we practice Christian hospitality? And where has my community failed to practice Christian hospitality? Lord, I pray for the many times that I have been inhospitable to others because I don't want to hear what they have to say because they are coming from a different place. And Lord, I want to pray for those times that as communities as a whole, we do this to others. When we do it to the young, when we do it to the elderly or the older, when we do it to men, when we do it to persons and families with disabilities. I bring that to you and I ask for your forgiveness and for the grace to act hospitably, to welcome difference, remembering that welcoming the stranger means welcoming you. Lord, hear us. Who are the ones who do not receive hospitality in my church community? How have I failed to practice Christian hospitality in my family, in my work, in my community, on a daily basis? Lord, I think of every parent who has had a baby or a child who others believe are being disruptive, and who instead of being welcomed or helped, are glanced at, are stared at until they feel unwelcome. I pray for those mothers. Lord, I pray for our young people who, in just being young with exuberance and passion, are not understood by older persons, who think that they are too young to have any voice. I think of the times that young persons are sometimes humiliated and embarrassed by older persons. I think of young persons who do not have advocates to stand on their side. Lord, I think of those families with persons with disabilities. many of whom have stopped going to church or no longer take their children to church. Lord, I bring to you all those who struggle with different areas of their sexuality, and because of that, have pulled themselves away from church, thinking that church is not a place that will welcome them. Those who are afraid to be judged. Lord, I bring to mind all single parents. I bring to mind all married couples. I bring to mind those couples who struggle with infertility and who are constantly asked by others, so when you're getting your child? I bring to mind the many other strangers and persons who are alienated from their communities for whatever reason. Forgive, heal, and set us free. Lord, hear us. Who stands as a model for me of genuine hospitality? What do I admire about that person? When have I received hospitality from my church community? Lord, I think of all those who have gone before us, who have been remarkable witnesses of hospitality. Those who are famous, like Mother Teresa, like John Paul II, and those who we know in our own families. I think of my own grandmother and many others like her, women of generosity. I think of my grandfathers, men of generosity in our communities. I think of persons who have extended a warm hand to me when I was down, to all those who have blessed me with their generosity. I think of those who give generously in all of our communities. I think of all the little gestures that are done to make me feel welcome, the smile on someone's face, someone offering to hold open the door for me. And I thank you for these persons. And I thank you for the spirit of generosity and hospitality that still continues. Lord, hear us. When have I practiced Christian hospitality? And how can I practice Christian hospitality during this time of pandemic? Lord, you know this time has cut us off from many of our close friends and family because of fear. We also know all the requirements that are being asked of us as a nation at this time. The urge to be vaccinated, the fears that go along with that. Lord, because we know that you continue to be present to us in and through hospitality, show us ways that we can be hospitable right now with a phone call, with checking up on each other, with making sure that we spread good news to each other and not news that would bring others down, that we forward sound information and not conspiracy theories to each other. Make us creative during this time so that as we journey to our new normal, we would be able to really become practitioners of hospitality. Lord, hear us. What concrete things can my community do now to practice Christian hospitality? Lord, that we might be open to the many ways that our church is offering to be hospitable during this time. The drive to feed the poor among us, the urge to continue to keep checking up on each other, the initiatives that we are being called to support one another in prayer when we need it. Lord, hear us. All glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And so this was a process of us hopefully moving from xenophobia, the fear of the stranger, to philoxenia, the love of the stranger, the basis of our hospitality.
Adana, what a journey. Viewers, in the 2 sessions, Adana has placed on our hospitality plate what I can describe as both ailments and remedies. Adana, you've given us cause for reflective evaluation of our handshakes, our smiles, our response to calls for generosity, not only in our neighborhoods, but in our homes, and even in the Lord's house. You know, we have to ask, how welcoming are we? How do we secure the divine presence in our midst, which, as you say, is the consequence of hospitality? So we don't have a lot of time. In fact, we're out of time. So, but I feel you need to make a closing comment. You know, that focusing that we can take away.
And so if we know we don't have much time, so just to remember, if we look on the screen, some main points of what hospitality really is. It's about welcoming the stranger among us. We are all strangers. And to remember that they will know that we are Christians by our love, and they will know that we love by our hospitality. So thank you so much for making this journey with me. It was a pleasure. And I'm hoping that we can really go on to be hospitable people.
Thanks for that final message as we continue our journey. Because in this topic, you've really called us out on our understanding and practice of Christian hospitality. So, Adana, thanks very much